Greetings, everyone. I hope you're doing well. This is Dr. John Wineland again, and we're back talking about religion in America, sort of part two, I guess we'll call it. Religion in America, part two. So let's go ahead and get started with that. We're going to see, as we mentioned last time, that Christianity becomes an important part of the settlement of North America and of the development eventually of the United States. But even in the colonial period, religion plays a big role. Well, thank you. So one of the things that we see here, let me make myself disappear for a moment, that we can see that there's just many different groups. There are many different groups, church groups, that come here to North America. Of course, we've been talking a lot about the Anglicans because that's the Church of England, and so that's sort of the one. These are English colonies, but you would think that would be the main thing. But it is the main in some of these colonies. But just look at the vast array of different groups: Baptists, Congregationalists, Lutherans, Presbyterians, Dutch Reformed, French Reformed, German Reformed, Roman Catholic, Quakers. These are just the ones that we're listing here. And here is a look at, each one of these equals 10 churches. So this is kind of a snapshot. But take a look where you see the blue was Congregationalists. Look at Massachusetts, 231 congregations in Massachusetts, which was not a big area, and Connecticut. See how big it is there. Quite a few in New Hampshire as well. So you see the Congregationalist churches are sort of centered in the Northeast. But if you take a look in the South, Anglican churches, Maryland has a majority there. Lots in Virginia. We see them also in North Carolina, South Carolina, Delaware, New York, and so forth. So we see a lot there, but then take a look. Baptists begin to appear or develop. Lots in Pennsylvania, the majority in Rhode Island, because Rhode Island was actually founded by someone who started really the Baptist movement in America. And look at the place, Pennsylvania. Just look at how diverse Pennsylvania is. As well as some of these others like New Jersey and New York. Let's keep moving along. We'll take a look at each one of these as we go through. So let's talk about, bring myself back in here, I guess, and let me show you, let's talk about the Baptists in America. And of course, when we talk about the Baptists in America, we're talking about Roger Williams. And here is a nice portrait of Roger Williams. Roger Williams actually is an Anglican separatist, at least that's where he starts. But he's you might call him a Puritan. He wanted to purify the church, but a lot of his views got him sort of kicked out of the Plymouth colony. We'll put a map up here in a moment. Because he, was pretty fastidious about wanting this purification and opposing the state church. But one of the other things that sort of got him into a little bit of hot water with some of them there is that he supported Indian or Native American ownership of the land and thought that they should be compensated fairly for their land. And that also did not go over that well at the time. And so what he's actually going to do is leave. I think he was kind of asked to leave. And he's going to go over and start his own colony. He's going to start his own settlement that's going to become to be known as Rhode Island. So here is the map I was telling you about. Take a look. Here is the Plymouth colony. You could see it here. Plymouth colony, which later becomes a part of Massachusetts. The Plymouth colony. And he is going to be asked to to leave there, and he's going to move to the west. And he'll move to this area, which he will call Rhode Island, and he will found this city known as Providence. And of course, he calls it Providence because of God's providence. And so this then becomes a place of, and he buys this land, by the way. He buys it from the Native Americans and pays them money for it. Okay, so this is a nice map that kind of shows you some of these New England colonies. And, at the time, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, and Maine were sort of part of Massachusetts early on. And then Plymouth will later be incorporated into that. And so we see then Rhode Island forming. Rhode Island is chartered in 1648. And he buys the land from the Native Americans in this area, the Indians, and he starts the city of Providence. And in 1639, he founded a Baptist church, and this was the first Baptist church in North America. They had this kind of congregations in England, but this is the first one that was here. And in the charter of Rhode Island, it says that there will be a separation of church and state, that everyone will live according to their own conscience, the freedom of conscience, and there will be fair treatment of Indians. And so this is written right in to their charter. He also starts a college, which will come to be known as Rhode Island College. Of course, today it's called Brown University, named for a later major donor, but this begins in 1764. So this is one of the Ivy League schools there in Providence. Providence is an interesting town. I visited a few years ago. Very kind of an interesting place. Rhode Island's quite small. Providence, a very interesting town, sort of dominated by now Brown University. So let's take a look at religion in Rhode Island, shall we? These are those little squares. We bring up the legend so we can see it. Take a look. We do have, 8 or 9 Anglican churches, but take a look. We have 30 Baptist churches by comparison, and maybe 12 Congregationalists, and 3 or 4 Quaker congregations. So predominantly a Baptist background, and so actually Brown University began as a Baptist university or college. Well, let's take a look at Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania has an interesting story religiously. Here, of course, is William Penn, a very young William Penn here. He receives this as a kind of payment from the crown for basically debts that were there, and so they paid him in land. And so, Pennsylvania is quite a large state, especially east to west. And this colony, the Penn colony, which and by the way, the word Sylvania means the forests or the woods. So this is really Penn's Woods or Penn's Forest. Or maybe you've heard of Transylvania. That means you're across the woods, you're across the forest. But this is Penn's Woods. So this is a land payment for the king's debt. And William Penn was a Quaker. Now the Quakers were not accepted in England. I mean, they were often discriminated against and so forth. But he was, of course, a wealthy Quaker, and he wanted to have a place where Quakers could be accepted. But given the fact that he's a Quaker, he doesn't exclusively make it a Quaker colony. He opens it for everyone. He calls it a holy experiment. Now, the Quakers have interesting ideas that distinguish them from, let's say, other groups, Protestants and so forth. They don't use external sort of physical things in their worship. For example, they don't have any form of water baptism. They don't have any form of physical communion. They say that baptism is spiritual, communion is spiritual, that sort of thing. And they have this kind of almost a little bit of a mystical side to them with this inner light. The inner light that's in them will guide them into the truth. And so, at their Quaker meetings, okay, at the meetings in their meeting houses, they would sit, and often sit very quietly, and wait for someone to receive a kind of message from the inner light, and they would actually begin to shake or quake, and then they would share that with everybody in the meeting. So this group was not accepted really in England because they had sort of different ideas and different practices which didn't quite fit what anybody else was doing at the time. So he calls Pennsylvania, or Penn's Woods, Penn's Forest, the holy experiment. And he says all groups are welcome. All groups are welcome in Pennsylvania. So with all these groups being welcome, what can we say about the religion in Pennsylvania? So let's put up our little graph again. I know it's a little bit fuzzy, but it's the best thing I could find. I think it really illustrates the diversity that we see, especially here in Pennsylvania. Take a look at this. It's a Quaker colony, but look at that. The Quakers are not the majority at all. In fact, they're one of the smaller groups, maybe about 20 congregations. What's the largest group? Lutherans. A lot of people now from Germany end up coming to Pennsylvania. And they come, they are Lutherans. We see a lot of them are German Reformed and Lutherans, right? We see, of course, we got a good number of Baptists. We have some Dutch Reformed and some Roman Catholics, as well as Quakers. So a lot of Germans migrate. This is because there were groups within Germany which were not accepted, like the Lutherans in part, but certainly because in certain areas Lutherans were banned, and so they decided to move. And we also will see Moravians, which were a group that was not accepted there. And so this is why we sometimes call, you might heard somebody mention Pennsylvania Dutch, the Pennsylvania Dutch. This is really a distortion of Pennsylvania Deutsch, and Deutsch is the word for Germans. So there were a lot of Germans settled in Pennsylvania during this period. And so let's take a look at that. Mennonites will come, and Lutherans. Mennonites are Anabaptists. And here we see the Mennonites, or one group of Mennonites are Amish, which perhaps you have encountered, the Amish, who lived distinctively sort of in the past as far as culturally, not driving cars, many of them, wearing very plain clothes, as we see in this picture here. So Mennonites of various kinds will settle especially near Philadelphia, but other places as well. And I don't, they spread across Pennsylvania. There are large Mennonite Amish communities in Ohio and Indiana and other places as well. Moravians are an interesting group. They settle near Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. The Moravians are a group in Germany. They were not accepted. They were sort of kicked out. And we've got Henry Muhlenberg, who begins the first Lutheran synod in the Americas in 1748, also in Pennsylvania. Now, another group that's going to come to Pennsylvania, and this will relate to our later discussions about Restoration history, are going to be Presbyterians, a lot of Presbyterians. Now, if you don't know it, many of the early pivotal leaders of the Restoration movement were Presbyterians, and they did come and settle in Pennsylvania. So the Presbyterians then were coming, really they're called the Church of Scotland, is the Presbyterian Church, as opposed to the Church of England. They were very Calvinistic, and many of them were settled by the English in the northern part of Ireland to try to sort of get some control on the island of Ireland, which was predominantly Roman Catholic. And so this is the tension that you see between Northern Ireland and the rest of Ireland, which of course went on for a very long time and still is not completely gone. Presbyterians, you will find them in Ireland. They're really of Scottish descent, and of course in Scotland. And then many of them are going to move to North America, and a lot of them will end up in Pennsylvania as well. Some in the Appalachian Mountains. So by 1710, there are 200,000 Presbyterians who have migrated, moved, immigrated to America, and most of them are in Pennsylvania or nearby, sometimes in New York, New Jersey, and a lot of them, of course, in the western part of Pennsylvania. The first presbytery was in 1729. Francis McNamee will set up the first Presbyterian presbytery, which is sort of their organization of how they organize their churches. They follow, of course, the Westminster Confession of Faith, and we're going to say more about that later, but this is a creed or a confession of which they must proscribe not only the ministers, but everybody in the church. Let's move to another group that becomes very important in America, and that is Methodism. Methodism, you can identify it with John Wesley, pictured here. He and his brother Charles. And there's much more we could say about it, but they worked together. This all sort of was born or created at Oxford University, and when they were students and then later tutors there, they began a methodical way of studying the Bible. And so Methodism is really a nickname that was given to them, that they were Methodists or Methodistic in their approach. But they were also sometimes insulted and called Bible bigots and called Bible moths and that sort of thing, because they vowed to live a kind of holy life. And so many of the students and others didn't really appreciate their approach. Now, here in North America, John Wesley, who never really intended on starting his own group or church, I guess I would say, or denomination, and in fact, he was an Anglican minister, and he remained such for his entire life. But he would preach, and his brother Charles wrote thousands of songs, and many of the great hymns that we sing, Charles Wesley wrote. So you can keep that, especially around Christmas, and a lot of the great Easter hymns, a lot of the old hymns he wrote. So we see that John Wesley will send Richard Broadman and Joseph Pilmore as missionaries in 1768 to America to attempt to bring this sort of methodological. What they would do is he would preach outside. He was an Anglican minister, but of course many people didn't feel comfortable going into the church building. They didn't have the right clothes and that sort of thing. And so, a lot of what he was doing was, I don't know if it wasn't officially sanctioned by the church. He would just meet out in the public square and preach. And then maybe his brother would have a song, and they would sing a song or two. And then they would basically invite them to a Bible study, we might call it, where they would meet with one leader and 11 participants, so 12, following after sort of the model of Jesus. And they had Bible study groups, and from that they created a network of Bible study groups and a method of study and so forth, and this will eventually become a church group known as the Methodist Church. Well, here in North America, Francis Asbury, who will come in 1771, will be the first bishop of the Methodists here, because they do have, they are ruled by bishops. And in fact, since in America they're just getting started, he is not only the first, he is the only bishop. Here's a painting of him, an illustration of him being ordained as a bishop. Now, Asbury's an interesting character. John Wesley traveled all around preaching thousands and thousands of sermons in his lifetime. Asbury will do the same. And he will ride on horseback like Wesley did, but he's riding around this sort of frontier of America. And this is why the Methodists become so prolific in America, is because of the circuit riding preacher. They would ride, these preachers would ride, usually with a Bible and usually with a gun, and they would be on horseback, and they would be serving multiple congregations at once. So they would ride their horse, and that means they weren't there every Sunday at that church. The church would meet, the congregation would meet. The minister might only show up once a month, something like that. So he would maybe go to 2 congregations in a Sunday, maybe 3, but usually 2, and then do one thing. So you could have 8 congregations, that is 7 or 8 that you're serving by doing two every Sunday, and once a month. Okay, so this means the others who were there, the members, would hold a prayer meeting, that sort of thing, have singing and this sort of, in the absence of the minister, and the minister would show up, take care of the burying and the marrying and all the official things that would go on. But Asbury made it his policy as the bishop that he would visit every preacher every year. Now, he didn't visit every congregation. That would be impossible. But like I said, if a minister is riding a circuit of, say, 7 or 8 churches, Asbury would make sure that he visited that minister at one of those churches every year. So this means he was riding on horseback about 6,000 miles a year. And in his 44 years, it's been estimated that he traveled over 265,000 miles on horseback. He was noted for getting by on just 6 hours of sleep a night, and getting up early, and riding his horse, preparing his sermons. And this is the way the frontier was met. And this is why the Methodist churches will accelerate rapidly once they start, by using this method of a circuit riding preacher. Now, some of the other concerns that we have, one is about education. And, of course, the church gets involved with education. One of the things that the church wants is it wants people to be able to read the Bible. And, of course, the problem is many of the people could not read the Bible. And there was no, as we have today, very elaborately organized educational systems. And so there weren't public schools and that sort of thing. So most education was done privately, but some people could not afford that. You'd have to pay for a tutor, pay for a teacher, pay to send your child there. So this desire to understand the Bible will lead in New England to them creating schools that would be funded by the city and or the state. So this is sort of the beginning of public education in America. Was mostly in the north and the northeast. In the south, they're using mostly private tutors that would come to large plantations or estates. Maybe 2 or 3 families would go together and hire a teacher together who would meet at one location, and the kids would go there. But then we see eventually developing secondary schools, which which were called Latin schools or grammar schools, because in those schools it's called a grammar school, which is different than what we tend to think of grammar school being like first through fifth grade. But basically, what the student needed to do was to learn Latin, because Latin was the instruction of higher education. It was in Latin. You were required to read Latin to enter college, not to get out of college. I remember several years ago when I was a graduate student at Miami University in Ohio, not in Florida, that I found on the shelf in the library the entrance exams to Miami University in, say, 1890, that sort of thing. And I was very interested to read that basically you had to pass an exam in either Latin or Greek to get into college. You had to pass a lot to do with history, philosophy, so forth. Geography. They had all these tests. So you had to pass this test. You had to take it and pass it to get in to the university. And I thought to myself, I don't know how many people could now pass that to get out of the university. But of course, it was a different time. Latin was the language of education and of learning. Well, colleges then become quite important. We've already mentioned Brown University, but why were these colleges started? They were started to train ministers. As we already mentioned, Brown University were for the Baptists, but Harvard, certainly you've heard of Harvard, was there to train Anglican ministers. That is, a Church of England, Anglican, or later we would call them Episcopalians. It was there to train them as ministers. In 1636 is when it starts. The College of William and Mary starts in 1693. It was also Anglican. Yale was for Puritans, started in 1701. Princeton started for Presbyterians in 1746. And we've already mentioned Brown University starts in 1764. And it's for Baptists. So what you see here is that universities and even the Ivy League, it was all started to train ministers. And of course, over the years, that has been diminished. I would say most of these do have seminaries there still, but the main focus, obviously, of the school is no longer that. And so this is something to keep in mind, that the church is very much a part of education. And I think we should continue in that role, by the way. Well, let's take a look at a major event that takes place in North America, and that is the First Great Awakening. What we see in both England and then later in the United States is a cycle of revivals that takes place. Cycle of revivals is common in America and Britain. Theodore Freundlinghuysen, that's easy for me to say, was a Dutch Reformed preacher in 1726 who will influence the Presbyterians into this way of thinking that there needed to be a kind of revival or renewal of the church. And this will be taking place by Gilbert and William Tennant in New Jersey and New York. And so this, part of the thing that actually kind of diminishes a kind of revival is the idea of Calvinism. Remember, one of the points of Calvinism is that you cannot choose God. God has already chosen you before you were even born. So this, if you think about this, when it comes to evangelism, what would this do to evangelism? It means that evangelism, you can go out, you preach evangelistic sermons, but it's really not going to convert people in the sense we might think of it as doing, because those people are either among the elect or they're not. But we see during the First Great Awakening, some of this begins to break down. And in fact, there begins to be a sort of groundswell for revival and that sort of thing. And this guy certainly played a huge part in that. His name is Jonathan Edwards, 1703 to 1758. Jonathan Edwards was a Congregationalist. Now, most Congregationalists, and he included, would write out their whole sermon. They would write it out, and then they would read it to the congregation so that they'd have it very precisely done. I suspect that most of the sermons you hear today are not read to you from a manuscript, but that's what they were doing. But that means we have all these sermons, and some of them they would read with great passion. So we shouldn't mistake it that because they're reading it that it was boring or unemotional, because that would be a false assumption. He read with great passion, and his most famous sermon, I would say, probably one of the most famous sermons in early American history, is Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, where he describes that God holds you in his hand. He's angry. He could let you go at any time into the hellfire, really. We don't hear much about hell in sermons anymore, or damnation, or even much about hell at all, because people don't like to talk about it today. They don't usually use that word. It'd be interesting to go through and see how many times somebody mentions hell or damnation or being lost, burning in eternal fire, that sort of thing. These kind of fire and brimstone sermons are not around today. But he certainly was there, and this certainly set the stage for that. He was very much interested in evangelism. He became a missionary to the Indians in his area. He went there for 8 years and worked with them, trying to evangelize them for Christianity. He is then called to be president of Princeton University, which, remember, was a Presbyterian school training ministers. And when he got there, he finds out that most of the students there are not really following Christian lifestyle. They're not really going to chapel. They're not really doing any of those things. And he begins to preach to them. And really, it's a revival. The First Great Awakening kind of starts on the college campus as a revival that will then spread around America. Well, I thought I would put this here for you. This is just a little excerpt of his sermon. You're probably unaware of this. You notice that you are being kept out of hell, but you do not see that it's God's hand keeping you out. Instead, you look at other things, such as your good health, the way you take care of yourself, the things you do to preserve your life. But in fact, these are nothing. If God withdrew his hand, these things would no more keep you from falling than thin air holds up a person suspended in it. Your own wickedness weighs you down like lead and is dragging you down towards hell with great weight and force. Again, if God would let you go, you would immediately sink, quickly descending and plunging into the bottomless gulf. Well, just a little excerpt of Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. Well, here's another great revivalist preacher. His name is George, looks like Whitefield, but it's pronounced Whitefield. George Whitefield, 1714 to 1770. George Whitefield is from England, but he will come to North America, and they're having a revival in England, but he comes here to North America during the height of the revival. The height of this First Great Awakening is 1738 to 1769. By the way, the fact that we call it the First Great Awakening ought to clue you in that there's going to be at least one more, and that comes to be called the Second Great Awakening, and that's really when the Restoration movement takes off. Well, we'll talk about that later. But George Whitefield will make 7 trips to America. These are preaching tours, we might call them. He goes all around preaching in a very passionate way. He ends up preaching in every single colony. And so he is one of the big names that promotes this first Great Awakening, George Whitefield. Now, what are the results of this first Great Awakening? Well, one of the things that we see is we see quite a few people evangelize. 30 to 40,000 converts and 150 new churches in New England. Now, of course, you got to imagine the population at the time was fairly low, so this is a significant number of people, much more than it might seem today. But, of course, 30 to 40,000 is still pretty impressive. And we'll see even more converted in the middle and southern colonies. So with all these new converts and all these new congregations, how is that going to change things? Well, one of the things they're going to do is going to make the United States a more holy place, let's say. Increased morality of the way people lived. We sometimes tend to think that early Americans were all very religious and very devout. That's simply not the case. This is also going to lead to the development of a lot of new colleges to train new ministers so they can go to these new congregations, because there's a tremendous amount of congregations who don't have a minister, and so we need to train them for all these new churches. We also see an increase in the missions to Native Americans or Indians, because there will be a real concern for their salvation and for taking Christianity to them here on the sort of the frontiers of the early part of America. And we also see a kind of division between what comes to be called Old Light and New Lights. Old Lights and New Lights. The Old Lights didn't like this revivalistic stuff. They thought it was too emotional. They thought it was too disorganized. They didn't really like it. The New Lights were all for it. And so this kind of divided people within the church and within different groups. The Presbyterians, for example, some would be Old Lights, some would be New Lights. And so that's really what this issue is about. Are you sort of for this kind of revivalism or not? Another thing that's going to happen, of course, here in the history of early American history, it has to do with the state church, the church and state that we see here, church and state. Remember, we are a country that does not have a state church. Why is that? Well, there are so many divisions here in America. They come from Europe, because remember, it started really after the Reformation. And so you saw all those little blocks that we have. There are Presbyterians, there are Lutherans, there are Mennonites, there's Anglican, there's Baptist, and there's Quakers, and so forth. All these different divisions that are transplanted to America means that these state churches that are in the colonies really begin to fall by the wayside, because there is no dominant group across the colonies to say that we could sort of, in a national way, have a state church. No dominant group, so the idea of a national religion or a state church is abandoned because they consider it to be unworkable, because we have such diversity here in America. So the separation then of church and state, right? We see this is what comes down to, really, as far as in our Constitution. Congress shall make no law respecting the establishment of religion, nor prohibiting free exercise thereof. So really all the debate over church and state really comes down to the interpretation of that phrase. Maybe not that alone, but that's the major one. In other words, Congress is not going to give any money to set up a church or to bolster a church or to keep a church going, nor will Congress try to keep any religion out. And so this is why we see in America today that we have lots of different religions, not just different kinds of Christianity. We have Islam, we have Judaism, Baha'i, and who knows what else, all kinds of other groups. But what this will mean here in America that's different from Europe, where they have a state church, and that means the state church is funded by, let's say, England. It's funded by the taxes of England. It's funded by the taxes of Germany and France. That's not going to ever happen here. And so churches are going to have to depend on voluntary gifts to stay in business, to keep doing what they want to do. And so that changes the whole dynamic of the congregations. And when we start to see, for example, the revolutionary ideas coming about that America, that the colonies would separate from England, you don't want to be going around as a member of the Church of England or the Anglicans. And that's really where here in America, we don't call it the Church of England. We don't really call it the Anglicans all that much. We usually call it the Episcopal Church or the Protestant Episcopal Church, which is formed in 1789. And when all this rumbling comes, many of those who are loyal to the crown will flee to Canada. And also in Canada, as we mentioned, I think in the previous lecture, there are a lot of Roman Catholics that move into the French part of Quebec, and they have special rights there, even though that's a British territory, that they can settle there in the Act of 1774. Well, I'm hoping that this gives you a little idea, a little introduction to some of the church history that comes from Europe. This is the key thing. These divisions and a lot of these things in Europe will be transplanted here in North America, and then we have to deal with them here. And a lot of the cases, a lot of the situations that they had there don't apply here because we don't have a state church, because we don't have these kinds of issues here. But those issues are brought here because they're being transplanted, if you will, to here in North America. This is sort of setting the ground for what it's going to be like and what they're going to be dealing with when we get to the Restoration movement, and that's why we have been covering this. Well, that's it for this time. We'll see you next time. Goodbye.